The idea behind this project was to quickly and easily add a mechanism for making it simple to load view-specific JavaScript and CSS resources. Traditionally, I've always done this in all of my projects over the past 13 years by adding that code directly to the templates themselves, but I thought it would be nice for the framework to have some simple helper functions to make it easier for future developers to quickly and easily add those dynamic resources to their products. PHPainfree version 2 comes with a Docker container ready to go so that we can spin up a development environment fairly quickly. Now that the server's running, I'm ready to open up NeoVim and start coding. The first thing I do is open up the base view so I can get a look at the code that I'm trying to replace. Inside Painfree.php, I scroll down to the existing helper functions logic and view. This is really a great place for me to put these new helper functions. The first one I start building is load.js. This is going to take two arguments. The first is a view, which is a string that is going to contain the name of the file we're trying to load. And it's also going to have an optional argument called defer, which is a Boolean set to true. When this is set, the script tag that is generated is going to have the defer attribute on it. Now that the function is stubbed out, I'm going to quickly write some documentation so that I get a sense for how the function is going to work inside the context of the framework. As I wrote the documentation, I realized this needed to output a string always, even if the string was empty, so that you could include this in any template you were going to use safely. I also decided that we were going to start using PHPdoc syntax for all of our documentation inside the code, and I have to quickly look up all the different names and parameters that PHPdoc defines. For the next 15 minutes or so today, I spent so much time fighting with the design and look and feel of the framework from a code style perspective. I really care about the look and feel of the code inside the core framework, and I went out of my way trying to figure out the best way to express what these functions are doing and how they were meant to be used. I went back and forth on line length, names of variables, all sorts of things over and over and over again, trying to find the look and feel that matched what I was trying to accomplish with this code. I just couldn't get it right until I had finally gotten to a stage where I implemented what I was trying to do, and everything matched what I had in my head and how I wanted these functions to be used. I took a brief look at Painfree.php to see how we were currently using configurable folders. Then I started looking at possibly adding a new property to Painfree.php to control the path to the static root directory before realizing that there was probably a more elegant way to do this. I finally decided that all of these options needed to be configurable inside of Painfree.config.php, just like the template folder and logic folder are currently. I very briefly considered renaming all of these parameters to be paths instead of folders, but then I realized that they aren't actually paths, they're just the name of an individual folder. It's outside the scope of this feature, but I leave myself a little bit of room in the configuration here for future dynamic loading of controllers by configuration. I quickly switch over to the base view template because I want to use Painfree debug to let me take a look at the runtime values of what the Painfree object instance have with all these new configuration options. What follows is an extremely painful amount of time fighting with how I'm going to build these strings of paths for each of these different locations that we're going to load dynamically. I just couldn't get it right. I couldn't get it to look how I wanted, and I kept going back and forth on the design of these string paths. I briefly detoured down a path of building an array of paths inside the class constructor. By the time I'd gotten several of them typed in, I realized I hated how it looked, and I decided I wasn't comfortable adding additional string building operations inside of each and every request. Ironically, by the time I had a solution that I was pretty happy with, I realized that I neglected to provide a path for myself that could be used inside the script tag itself. a relative path to the document root of the Apache web server. Fixing this ended up giving me a more elegant way to create these paths, and now I have everything finished and ready to test. I quickly create a JavaScript file named test inside the JS views folder, then switch over to the base view template. This technique of dying to halt execution and view the output of a specific function is the printf debugging technique of PHP. I wrap this entire call to load JS inside of Painfree safe so that I can view the escaped script tag output in the browser. And whoops, there was a syntax error. Apparently you can't use the ternary operator inside the PHP complex curly syntax. So close. Just forgot the file. Now that that's working, all that's left to do is to implement the same thing for the CSS files. I'm able to reuse almost all of the code from Load.js, and because I don't feel like I need to support any of the special link element attributes like the media specifiers, this function will end up being a lot less complex than what I built for JavaScript. I can remove the defer argument entirely. After testing that everything works, I realized that this function has a secret superpower, which is loading arbitrary file locations. With this, these same two functions can load a script or CSS file from inside an arbitrary subfolder as long as it's inside one of those configured folder paths. This will be useful if anyone ever needs to use any third-party libraries that come packaged inside of a folder. I briefly consider writing a similar function to load view templates, but decide to leave that for a future ticket. Then, I add these two new helper methods to the documentation menu and create a GitHub issue to write this documentation at a later date. I do one final check over the outputted HTML to make sure it looks nice, and clean up the example base view code to make it apparent as to what is happening. The last thing I polish up before considering this feature complete is the documentation inside the view-specific JavaScript and CSS folders. I want to make sure that anyone using this framework for the first time will be able to quickly see their options when they're looking at the source code. And that's it. About an hour of coding followed by 6 hours of video editing to add a feature to PHPainfree. This framework fits my mental model of web development, and I want to make sure that others have a similar experience. Let me know in the comments if you enjoy this kind of behind-the-scenes video. If you did, a like on this video really helps with YouTube algorithms, and if you'd like to have a more active role in future videos, consider joining our Discord server. It's free, and you get to hang out with a bunch of other programmers that think programming is easy.